Yes, welcome to our daily programme all about the EU election, which is now just 6 days away. With me here in the studio are Europe editor Armen Georgian. And Armen, what have you got for us first of all today?
Hi Nadia. Well, we're going to go to Italy first, where the political temperature is rising, anti-government protesters clashing with police in Rome, demonstrators denouncing what they see as the government's pro-Israel bias. And the protest highlighting a fault line in this European campaign between right-wing support for Israel and left-leaning parties which emphasize the plight of the Palestinians. Now, these clashes happened as the main political forces in Italy held their final big rallies ahead of voting day. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is standing in the EU election, even though as a national lawmaker she cannot take up a seat in the European Parliament.
We are at a turning point. It's as if we're facing a referendum between two opposing visions of Europe. On the one hand, an ideological, centralized, nihilistic, increasingly technocratic and increasingly undemocratic Europe. On the other hand, our Europe. Concrete, courageous, proud, and never forgetting its roots, because they define who we are in time and in space, and they help us to find our bearings in the darkness of fear.
Well, the centre-left Democratic Party has also held its final rally. It is expected to come in second, behind the governing Brothers of Italy. Here's the Democratic Party's leader, Elly Schlein.
We need a federal Europe today, because we need to fight inequalities across borders. That is what we have been fighting for over the past 5 years. There is not a single crucial challenge for the future that can be solved within national borders alone. Think of the pandemic. Think of the climate crisis. Think of migration. Think of fiscal justice.
Very contrasting views of Europe there, I think you'll agree, Nadia.
Yes, certainly. And that's a snapshot then, Armen, of the debates playing out in Italy at the moment. Take us, though, to what's happening here in France, because I understand there's a new opinion poll out just today.
Absolutely, and it does not make for comforting reading for President Macron's Renaissance, which, according to this new poll, is on 16%, that bar in the middle, and snapping at his heels are the Socialists with 14.5%. That's typically within the margin of error for opinion polls. And of course, no big surprise there, but still the far-right National Rally, that bar on the top left of our screen, 33%, a seemingly unassailable lead there with just a few days to go.
All right, such an important story. We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, throughout the week, new polling, if it comes in. Armen Georgian, for the moment, thanks very much indeed. Now, on the other side of the studio with us today, Luke Brown for our Everyday Europe segment. And he's not here alone. He's brought, some trash with him here into the studio? Because, Luke, you're going to be telling us about how the EU wants us to clean up packaging waste that's filling up landfills across Europe.
Yes, the new laws introduced back in the spring of this year are restrictions on packaging waste to ensure less is thrown away. Now, why is that important? Well, we can take a look at all of this. Bottles, plastic wrappers and so on, so forth. In all, in 2021, that represented close to 84 million tonnes of packaging waste produced in the EU. That corresponds to 190 kilos per inhabitant. The new goal for the EU is to reduce that 84 million figure tonne figure by 5% by 2030, 15% eventually by 2040. How do they mean to go about that? There's going to be reduce, reuse, recycle are the watchwords there. There's going to be bans from 2030 for things such as these single-use condiments, also single-use plastic packaging for fresh fruit and veg, for food and drink in cafes and restaurants, and also the end of free small bottles of toiletry in hotels. On the recycling front, there's going to be requirements to have improvements really across the board. All packaging must be potentially recyclable. Most packaging must be potentially recyclable by 2030. The aim there is for 55%. And they want to attack both sides, really, of the coin. The manufacturers, they have to include, for example, recyclable bottles, have to include recyclable plastic content of around 35% in the next few years. And consumers too, there's a circular recycling economy. The EU wants 90% of of plastic and metal beverage containers to be recyclable, so you're likely to see in future a return of the deposit return containers that we've been seeing springing up in French supermarkets in recent months.
That EU buzzword, circular economy. So look, how much does the EU actually recycle?
Well, one of the big problems at the moment in the EU is there is a requirement and a need really to harmonise progress across the EU. There's a lot of variation in recycling rates. For example, Germany, of course, known for its green tendencies, they recycle 70% of their household weight. France, closer to the EU average, has 45%. The other far end of the extreme, Hungary, 35%. Romania only recycles 11% of household waste. Overall, then, the average is around just under half. But the problem there, again, is that the EU sends a lot of its waste to be recycled and treated outside of the EU, a total of 20 million tonnes per year, most of that heading, for example, to Turkey. A new law in the EU introduced just this year means is trying to resolve some of the problems about that, the moral problems about that. The EU countries can only continue to export their waste if there's a guarantee that it will be treated in a sustainable manner. So basically, the EU will have to prevent sweeping under the carpet outside of the EU its own waste.
All right, Luke Brown, thanks very much indeed. And look, when Luke isn't with us here in the studio telling us all about package waste, what's changing here within the EU, he can be found on occasion roaming the forests of Estonia. That's where civilians have been volunteering for military training in case of a Russian incursion into the former Soviet Republic. Here's his report.
Sunday morning in a forest in Estonia, but this is no recreational walk in the woods.
And our company is at the moment doing medevac procedures because we have some casualties.
Drones buzzing overhead, assault rifles and heavy weapons in their hands. For these Estonian civilians, it's not just a war game. They're training to protect their homes and their homeland. Today's adversary, played by a unit from the French Foreign Legion, part of the NATO presence in the country.
We're impressed by the ability they have. They're civilians who are giving up their weekends, who are giving up their time to train in combat skills and learn about defending their rear positions.
The exercise pits 100 Estonian civilians against the force of professional French soldiers. Facing blank rounds and an intense assault, the Estonian forces are eventually overwhelmed. Indeed, with a standing army of only 5,000 professional soldiers, faced with a hostile force many times larger, Estonia has no choice but to rely on auxiliaries in case of invasion. The Estonian Defence League can count on 30,000 of these highly motivated volunteers.
We have to defend our families. We saw what happened in Ukraine, so we have to be ready.
I have 4 children. It's a weekend. Normal people would be spending their weekends with their children, doing something else. But we are doing this because we have to. Because of our not so nice neighbor to the east.
Estonia still holds bitter memories of the Russian and Soviet occupations of the 20th century. This monument bearing the names of the thousands of civilian deportees from that era, sharing a 330-kilometre-long border with Russia and with a large ethnically Russian population, the question of its security dominates the political debate, meaning Estonia, ahead of the European elections, is counting more than ever on its Western, NATO and European allies to guarantee its security.
Well, in this sense, the impact is direct, that the issue number 1, issue number 2, issue number 3 in the campaign, it is about Estonian and European security.
Estonians' proposal is, and I think it is a good one, that from the European Union countries' GDP, everybody allocates 0.25% to defense of Ukraine, and Ukraine will be able to win the war. Because the alternative is much more expensive for Europe than to help right now.
While Estonia's political parties agree on the need for unity in the face of the Russian threat, the main points of division during the European elections are focused on the EU's Green Deal and the Estonian economy.
And that's it for Europe Votes today. Armin Georgian, Luke Brown, both back with me at the same time tomorrow. So do tune in if you can.